The morning they fired me, I didn't argue. I didn't demand explanations or threaten legal action. I simply packed my things, handed over my badge, and walked out of the building I had helped build from the inside for 16 years. As the glass doors closed behind me, I looked back only once, not for closure, but for calculation. They thought I was gone, erased, neutralized. But what they didn't know was that I had seen everything. Every doctored invoice, every shadow vendor, every approval trail carefully masked under fake credentials, including mine. My name had been used to launder their crimes, and they assumed I wouldn't notice. But I had the logs, I had the patterns, I had everything, and I wasn't just going to expose them. I was going to dismantle them, quietly, methodically, from the outside in. They had severed the wrong connection. I wasn't the liability. I was the failsafe. And by the time they realized it, the system they thought they controlled would already belong to me. I was erased in under 2 hours. No warning, no confrontation, no final meeting filled with pleasantries and a gold-embossed plaque. Just a bland email from HR and a silent escort to my car. 16 years, reduced to a click and a signature. As I sat behind the wheel, staring at the steel and glass facade of TexVolt's headquarters in Houston, the hum of the air conditioning was the only sound keeping me tethered to the moment. The building looked the same as it had the day I joined. Sterile, modern, impressive. And now it had decided I was obsolete. My name is Maxim Volkov, 48 years old, head of technical support at a mid-sized energy company that liked to talk about digital transformation more than it actually understood it. For over a decade and a half, I had kept the company's infrastructure running through hurricanes, blackouts, software meltdowns, and budget cuts. I had worked weekends, canceled vacations, rebuilt broken systems at 2 a.m, and trained 4 generations of IT staff who now barely made eye contact with me in the hallway. I never asked for recognition. I never made noise. I was, in their eyes, a constant. And constants don't need appreciation until they disappear. The shift had begun subtly. Password changes I didn't authorize. Memos I wasn't copied on. Meetings that moved forward without me. 3 months before my dismissal, a new hire arrived. A slick young director from Dallas named Arthur Denning, armed with buzzwords and spreadsheets. He smiled too much and listened too little. The CEO was enchanted. Suddenly, everything was agile and modular, terms tossed around to justify decisions that dismantled the foundation I had spent years building. I had known something was coming. I felt it in the silence that followed my emails, in the deferential way junior staff avoided asking me questions, as if associating with me might label them as outdated. I wasn't surprised when it happened, but I wasn't ready for the coldness of it. That night, I returned home with a cardboard box containing a framed photo of my wife and daughter, 2 engineering textbooks, and the small brass nameplate that used to sit on my desk. My wife Andrea didn't ask questions. She just placed a warm mug of tea beside me and sat nearby in silence. We had been through enough together that words were optional. I couldn't sleep. At 3 a.m, I found myself at the kitchen table with my old company-issued tablet. I had never returned it. They had probably forgotten it existed. When I turned it on, I expected to see the login screen locked or wiped. But it wasn't. My credentials still worked. The server pinged back. I had access, not full administrative, but enough to view logs, access audit trails, and check certain system processes. It was a mistake on their end. A lazy, dangerous mistake. For a moment, I hesitated. I wasn't a vengeful man. But this wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. Something didn't feel right. My firing was too abrupt, too surgical, as if I had been a threat, not a liability. I tapped into the access logs and began pulling event histories from the last 90 days. Every change, every elevated permission, every reconfigured user role was time-stamped and signed with a digital fingerprint. I created a secure offline copy and started reading. Patterns emerged. Files modified at night. Unusual logins from masked locations. My name used to approve changes I had never seen. By dawn, I knew this wasn't just corporate politics. It was an intentional purge. And I was just the first step. Paranoia is easy to dismiss, until the patterns begin to line up with the facts. In the weeks leading up to my dismissal, I had started noticing small inconsistencies. They weren't the kind of things that set off alarms on their own, but they left marks in my mind, like faint fingerprints on glass. Project updates that never reached me. Scheduled maintenance I hadn't authorized. Employees avoiding eye contact. Arthur Denning's growing presence in meetings that used to be mine. The company was slowly peeling me away from its core, like a leaf curling off a dying branch, and I had allowed it, rationalizing each red flag with logic and habit. I had always kept quiet backups. Not just data backups, but logs of access, approvals, audit trails, all tucked away in encrypted drives with rotating credentials. Years ago, I had built redundancy protocols to protect against insider threats. Ironically, those same systems were now my only lifeline to understanding what had truly happened. On Tuesday morning, with the luxury of unemployment and the stillness of an empty house, I began reviewing everything I had collected. The first detail that caught my attention was an access log from March 17th. A server login under my username had been executed at 3:17 a.m. from a virtual machine I didn't recognize. That alone wasn't extraordinary. Spoofing credentials happens. But this session had been used to modify user permissions across 5 internal platforms. The records showed M. Volkov as the approver. I had been asleep at that hour, like any human. But the system, apparently, believed I had worked in the shadows of the night. I dug deeper. Other late-night changes surfaced, always with my credentials, always tied to administrative elevation. The targets were consistent: finance systems, procurement logs, cloud deployment portals. It wasn't random. It was surgical. On Thursday, I drove out to a quiet corner of the city to a co-working space where no one knew me. I didn't trust my home network anymore. I logged into a dummy admin account I'd created years earlier as part of penetration testing. The credentials were still valid. Another oversight. I downloaded copies of access logs, patch records, and internal communications from the past 6 months. I created hashes and encrypted them locally, paranoid even in isolation. That evening, I reviewed archived email threads that were technically restricted but still indexed under my outdated credentials. Buried in a thread from 2 months prior, I found a conversation between Arthur Denning and the procurement team. They discussed fast-tracking licensing agreements for a third-party vendor called Delta Ray Technologies. The vendor name was new to me. I ran a trace. Delta Ray was registered as a limited entity 6 months earlier, with a business address listed as a mailbox in a strip mall in Sugarland. The company had no website, no staff directory, no corporate filings beyond the minimum. Yet TexVolt had approved over $700,000 in payments to it in the last 90 days, marked as software licensing and infrastructure optimization. On paper, everything looked legitimate, until you noticed the timestamps. The largest invoice, nearly $300,000, had been approved 48 hours after our former financial director was quietly let go. No internal memo had ever announced his departure. He had simply vanished from the company directory one morning, and a younger, quieter replacement had appeared without fanfare. I searched the system logs again. Delta Ray's invoices were submitted through an internal portal using a masked account that bypassed the standard approval process. The trail had been scrubbed, but not cleanly. An archived snapshot from 6 weeks prior showed access permissions granted by someone named A. Denning for a temporary administrator account. The name matched. The timing matched. The numbers were growing. By Saturday, I had a full picture. A shadow vendor channeling funds through automated licensing contracts, each approval masked under legitimate-looking credentials, some even using mine. If I hadn't been watching, no one would have noticed. It was elegant, simple, almost perfect. But there was something else. One of the payments, the earliest one, had been tagged with a digital note. DRT 124. I recognized the pattern. It was a placeholder code from our internal sandbox environment, one I had built myself. That meant whoever had orchestrated this wasn't just using stolen access, they were using insider tools. They knew the architecture intimately. The pieces were shifting into place. I had been removed not as collateral damage, but as a calculated risk. My knowledge of the back-end systems made me dangerous. Denning hadn't simply wanted me out of the way, he needed me silent. If I had accepted the dismissal quietly, everything might have continued unnoticed. I copied the files to 3 separate drives, each stored in a different location. One in my personal safe, one in Andrea's safety deposit box at the bank, and one with a former colleague who owed me a favor and knew how to keep things buried until they were needed. At 11:42 p.m., I received an automated alert from a private script I'd left running. My access was being revoked in stages. Email first, then cloud storage, then VPN. I was being erased, one credential at a time. The digital equivalent of burning my footprints as I walked away. But it was already too late for them. I didn't need access anymore. I had the truth. And now I needed a strategy. By Sunday morning, the pieces I had collected started to reveal a pattern too consistent to ignore. It wasn't just a matter of a ghost company siphoning off funds. The infrastructure of the fraud was layered and protected, each level designed to mimic standard corporate processes. At a glance, it all looked legitimate. But when I followed the money, line by line, timestamp by timestamp, it led to shadows. Delta Ray Technologies wasn't the only ghost in the system. I widened my net. I went through every payment TexVolt had made to third-party vendors over the past 12 months. I filtered for new accounts, rapidly increasing invoices, and unlisted procurement approvals. That's when I found the second name, Bridgecore Analytics, a supposed data consultancy that had received nearly $900,000 in service fees for migration risk reports. The payments began 3 months after Arthur Denning joined the company and followed the same pattern as Delta Ray, escalating in value, approved just below the threshold that triggered audit flags, and routed through automated workflows. The listed executive contact for Bridgecore was someone named Elias R. Jensen. I couldn't find a single mention of him in professional databases or tech forums. The address was another mailbox, this time in a suburb outside Austin. I pulled archived snapshots of the vendor registration portal and found that the submission metadata traced back to a static IP, an internal one, originating from Denning's former department. The deeper I dug, the more meticulous I became. I documented every digital footprint, created visual maps of fund flows, cross-referenced approval timestamps with known login sessions. What emerged was a coordinated siphoning mechanism that disguised itself as digital modernization. Each vendor was a shell company linked to someone in Denning's personal or professional orbit. They weren't stealing outright. They were padding costs, billing for phantom services, and rerouting just enough to stay under the radar. One transfer caught my attention, a $200,000 invoice that was marked urgent and bypassed 3 internal review steps. It was routed through a seldom-used emergency procurement channel reserved for disaster recovery protocols. That channel had been created by me 6 years earlier, designed to only activate during major outages. Now it had been exploited to cover financial misconduct. That struck a nerve. I began cross-checking names of TexVolt executives with property records and campaign donations. A familiar name surfaced. Michael Hollis, assistant controller. He had approved a cluster of questionable invoices and recently purchased a second home in Galveston. His financial records showed a sudden spike in credit line payments. I noted the pattern, flagged it, and added it to the growing dossier. By Monday evening, I had compiled over 300 pages of documentation, emails, system logs, vendor registrations, approval flows, and metadata fingerprints. Everything pointed to an internal conspiracy involving at least 4 people. At the center was Arthur Denning. Around him orbited compliant insiders and silent beneficiaries. Together, they had diverted over $2 million in a year. And I had the proof. But I wasn't going to hand it over to TexVolt's leadership. They had allowed this rot to take root. Some may have known. Some may have ignored it. Either way, I needed someone outside the chain of command. Someone with the authority to act without fear of backlash. I thought of Joan Mason, a board member who had once spearheaded the company's response during the 2021 energy crisis. She was meticulous, unshakable, and fiercely ethical. I had never worked directly with her, but her reputation was clean. On Tuesday morning, I printed a sanitized version of the report, stripped of speculation and focused solely on facts. I mailed it, with no return address, to Mason's private office. Alongside it, I included a simple note. Review thoroughly. There is more if needed. By the time I sealed the envelope, I knew that silence was no longer my shield. I had stepped out of the shadows. I just didn't know yet who might come looking. The first ripple arrived on Wednesday morning. It came not as a headline or a formal notice, but as a quiet signal buried in a private message from an old colleague. Thomas, a soft-spoken network admin I had mentored early in his career, reached out through an encrypted channel I'd given him years ago for emergencies. He said little, but his meaning was clear. Internal security had begun reviewing my activity logs. My name had been mentioned in hushed tones inside the IT department. Arthur Denning had personally requested an internal audit of all system access linked to my credentials, under the pretext of post-employment anomalies. They were trying to trace me through the very system I had once fortified. I deleted the message after memorizing it. The move was unsurprising, but it confirmed my timeline was tightening. I had stirred the water, and the currents were beginning to shift. That same afternoon, Andrea noticed an unfamiliar SUV idling near our home for hours. It didn't move. No one got out. There was no confrontation, no theatrics, just presence, a subtle warning. They wanted me to know I was being watched. That night, I backed up everything again. 3 separate encrypted drives, 3 secure storage points, the digital equivalents of lifeboats. I wasn't paranoid. I was precise. Redundancy had become a form of control, a ritual that centered me as the net tightened. In the early hours of the morning, I received another signal. A contact from my compliance days, now working at a private audit firm, sent a brief but telling note. TexVolt had retained external counsel for what he called a potential whistleblower containment matter. It was a sanitized phrase that meant one thing. The company feared exposure and was preparing legal defenses. They didn't know it yet, but it was too late. The documents were already duplicated, time-stamped, and circulated. My objective wasn't retaliation. It was detachment. I no longer wanted to hurt them. I wanted to remove their ability to hurt anyone else. By midweek, I turned my focus to structure. Documentation was no longer enough. I needed to transform data into narrative. I compiled a timeline that traced Denning's influence from the day he joined, through every policy shift and procurement approval. I annotated inconsistencies in vendor invoices, cross-referenced executive approvals, and linked the dates of financial anomalies with back-end system changes. I included visual data flows, access maps, and internal metadata snapshots showing who approved what, and when. But I didn't just want proof. I wanted resonance. The report had to be undeniable even to the willfully blind. So I wrote it like a blueprint. Logical, clinical, detailed to the point of discomfort. I embedded audit logs, source file hashes, and buried control IDs that only an insider would recognize. This wasn't an accusation. It was an autopsy. By Thursday morning, I was ready. I contacted Joan Mason through a private channel I had once used for security testing. I didn't identify myself in the message, only referenced an earlier engagement and mentioned the word Delta Ray. She replied within an hour. Her assistant offered a neutral meeting location, an anonymous office suite leased through a third-party contractor unaffiliated with TexVolt. I took a cab to avoid being tracked. The office was quiet and sparsely furnished, a temporary shell space used for mergers or private legal consultations. Joan arrived precisely on time. She looked the same as she had years ago, composed, deliberate, unaffected by corporate theater. I handed her the report in a sealed envelope and a secondary copy on a secure USB drive. Then I spoke. No emotions, no speculation. Just facts. I walked her through the timeline, explained the flow of funds, showed how internal controls had been circumvented. Her expression remained still, but her eyes moved constantly, scanning each page as I spoke. She asked only a few questions, sharp, targeted, necessary. She understood what she was reading. That was enough. When the meeting ended, she promised to convene an emergency audit session. I didn't ask for anything. I didn't request protection or acknowledgement. I just left. On the way out, I passed a receptionist who didn't even look up. I stepped back into the quiet of downtown Houston as the city went on with its indifferent rhythm. On Friday morning, I received a ping from a watchdog script I'd embedded in the company's infrastructure years ago, one of many legacy routines no one had ever bothered to disable. One of the core procurement databases had gone offline for maintenance. That was their move. Shutting doors, locking records, isolating variables. The digital equivalent of destroying a crime scene. But they were reacting to the wrong threat. The real data was no longer inside Tech's vault. It was in the hands of someone they couldn't manipulate or threaten. Someone who had nothing to lose, nothing to gain, just a responsibility to the truth. I sat back from my desk and stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the server fans in my home office. They had fired me, erased me, and tried to bury the past. But now, the timeline was out of their hands. The audit committee would see what I had seen. And this time, they wouldn't be able to look away. The calm before a storm has a particular weight. It isn't silence. It's pressure. By the end of the week, I felt it pressing against every part of my life. No headlines, no legal notices, no formal responses. Tech's vault had gone quiet in a way that only meant one thing: internal containment. The kind of strategic stillness where lawyers gather in corners, executives practice their expressions, and IT teams are told to scrub logs without asking why. But I knew better. The gears had started turning the moment I handed Joan Mason the report. They couldn't unsee it. I stayed off-grid for most of the week, operating from borrowed networks and remote setups, monitoring public records, internal press briefings, and changes to the company's directory structure. Every hour, I saw the subtle signs. Employee access tiers were being reshuffled. Certain departments were siloed. Scheduled projects were paused without explanation. One senior procurement officer, who had signed off on half a dozen Delta Ray invoices, suddenly updated her LinkedIn profile to "Open to Work." Another quietly removed any mention of Bridgecore Analytics from their resume. On Tuesday, a local tech publication published a brief article, "Tech's Vault Executive Realignment Amid Financial Review." It named no individuals but mentioned irregularities in vendor relationships and a strategic pause on third-party contracts. That wasn't coincidence. It was pressure seeping through cracks. I cross-referenced the article's metadata with Tech's Vault's internal IP logs, ones I had mirrored weeks prior. Someone from corporate communications had accessed the article multiple times within 10 minutes of its posting. They were watching. They were nervous. And that was good. By Thursday, Joan contacted me again. This time, not through intermediaries. Her message was direct. The audit committee had reviewed the materials and found them credible, extensive, and deeply troubling. 3 names were flagged for immediate suspension: Denning, the assistant controller Hollis, and procurement lead Garcia. The board wanted more. They wanted to speak with me, off the record, but with full access. They needed context, and I was the only one who had all the pieces. I agreed under 3 non-negotiable conditions: full anonymity from the remaining executive team, read-only status within internal systems for analysis, and direct reporting to the board. No intermediaries. Within a day, I was granted temporary credentials under an alias. It was surreal, returning through digital hallways I had once built. But this time, I wasn't there to protect the system. I was there to investigate its failure. From a secure terminal, I traced financial trails from Delta Ray to other auxiliary accounts. Some had been quietly deleted, but I had their hashes. I restored timelines, pulled contract metadata, and created node graphs that showed how money moved from Tech's Vault to shell entities, then to personal accounts masked through affiliate contractors. The scale of it was worse than I had imagined. What had started as inflated licensing fees had grown into a systemic pattern of vendor laundering across multiple departments. By Friday afternoon, I was scheduled for a closed-door digital session with the audit committee. No cameras, no recordings, just voice. I laid out everything: the code trails, the document manipulation, the timestamp alterations, and the behavioral patterns of approval workflows. I showed them how the architecture of trust had been used against them. how systems built to ensure efficiency were twisted into tools of concealment. When I finished, no one responded for nearly a minute. Then a quiet request. Would I consider stepping into a formal advisory role until the investigation concluded? I agreed on the spot, but with one revision. I wouldn't be advising. I would be directing the reconstruction. They accepted. That evening, as Andrea and I sat outside in the fading autumn light, she asked me what it all meant. I didn't have a simple answer. Justice wasn't a moment. It was a process. What mattered wasn't that the fraud had been exposed. It was that the structure that allowed it had been dismantled. Slowly, methodically, irreversibly. By Monday morning, Arthur Denning was officially removed from his post. 2 other executives were placed on indefinite leave. Tex Volt released a public statement acknowledging serious violations of financial ethics and internal procedures. The words were sterilized, devoid of the chaos behind them. But I didn't need acknowledgement. I already had what I came for. The system had been breached, and this time, I was the breach. 6 months after the investigation began, I stood at the edge of the 35th floor of Tex Volt's headquarters, watching the city breathe beneath me. The view stretched past the skyline of Houston, sunlit and dense, with no trace of the rot that had nearly consumed the company from within. A company I had once given my loyalty to, been discarded by, and ultimately returned to, on my terms, not theirs. I wasn't an employee now. I was something else. The title they gave me was Chief Systems Integrity Officer, a newly minted position that didn't exist before everything fell apart. A role created because no one wanted to be caught blind again. My office was quiet, minimal. I didn't need the corner or the leather furniture, but they gave it to me anyway, a ceremonial reminder that I had earned this view. My badge opened every door. My decisions didn't pass through approval chains. I reported directly to the board, bypassing all the traditional pathways that had once hidden the corruption in plain sight. The systems I now oversaw were rebuilt from scratch. I had redesigned the entire digital architecture to be transparent, traceable, and above all, immutable. My team had changed too. The younger analysts I once mentored were now department leads. Stephen, especially, had grown into someone capable. He ran the daily operations with a quiet confidence that reminded me of who I used to be before politics and money poisoned the air. I gave him room to lead, but he knew I was watching. The same way I had always watched, without making noise. The fallout from the scandal had been severe but contained. Over $5 million in fraudulent transactions had been uncovered. Most of the funds were recovered. Denning was indicted on federal fraud charges along with 2 accomplices. One took a plea deal. The other tried to disappear but was brought back under a sealed warrant. The shell companies, Delta Ray, Bridgecore, and 2 more we hadn't even known existed, were dissolved. The internal procurement system was dismantled entirely and replaced with one I custom-built, devoid of backdoors and hidden routing paths. I spent those 6 months not rebuilding trust, but re-engineering the need for it. Systems couldn't rely on goodwill. They had to be designed to resist it. Every workflow, every approval, every financial transaction now left a footprint that couldn't be altered or deleted. The new controls didn't just protect the company from outsiders. They protected it from itself. Andrea adapted to the changes with quiet understanding. She never asked for details, but she saw the weight lift from my shoulders. We bought a small cabin north of the city, nothing extravagant, just peace. Every weekend we left the noise behind, and I learned to live again without scanning for threats in every silence. The board never tried to control me, not after the first week. They understood what I was, not a fixer, not an executive. I was a firewall, cold, logical, and unmovable. I told them once, in our first closed session, that my loyalty was no longer to Tex Volt as a name or brand, but to the integrity of systems. They laughed then, nervously. They didn't laugh again. One afternoon in early April, Joan Mason sent me a single-line message. Security budget approved, full support. That was all I needed. No arguments, no justification. Just validation that the system I had built was no longer up for debate. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Some wins don't require applause. That evening, as Andrea and I walked through the quiet halls of the building, a few employees nodded respectfully. They didn't fear me. They respected what I had done. They understood that the man who had once been quietly fired now walked the same hallways not for vengeance, but to ensure no one else had to fight the same battle in silence. She asked me once, as we sat on our porch, if I felt like I had won. I told her it wasn't about winning, it was about completion. About seeing the story through to the last page, and knowing it couldn't be rewritten behind closed doors. I hadn't burned the bridge. I had let it collapse under the weight of its own corruption, and then rebuilt it, stronger and cleaner than before. Now it stood, and I stood with it. Not because they let me back in, but because they had no